Hey guys, tonight we step into the sandals of the most consequential human being Rome ever produced. A man who reshaped an entire civilization, rewrote the rules of power, crossed a river he was told never to cross, and then had the audacity to name a month after himself. Tonight, we are telling the complete story of Gaius Julius Caesar. From his first breath in a cramped Rome apartment to the moment 23 men with daggers decided they'd had quite enough of him. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, because what follows is not the sanitized marble statue version of Julius Caesar. This is the full, complicated, occasionally terrifying, often brilliant life of a man who was broke at 30, irrelevant at 35, and ruler of the known world at 50. A man who won battles, wrote books, seduced queens, and made enemies with the same effortless energy. A man who, right up until the very end, genuinely seemed to believe that no one would dare lay a hand on him. He was wrong about that last part, but he wasn't wrong about much else. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Born into the storm Rome, 100 BC. Or possibly 102 BC. Historians are still arguing about it, which is appropriate because Julius Caesar spent most of his life making historians argue. The city he was born into is loud, crowded, and deeply unequal. Rome in the 1st century BC is a republic in theory and a pressure cooker in practice. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting angrier, and the political system designed for a city-state is slowly buckling under the weight of an empire it never planned to govern. Into this world, on the 13th day of the month the Romans called Quintilis, a baby arrives in the Subura district of Rome. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar. His family calls him Gaius. History will eventually call him something much grander than that. The Julii Caesaris, as his family was known, claim to trace their lineage all the way back to the goddess Venus herself, through her son Aeneas, through the founding myths of Troy and Rome. Was this true? Almost certainly not. But was it politically useful? Spectacularly. In Rome, claiming divine ancestry wasn't considered eccentric, it was considered strategic. The Caesars wore this divine bloodline like a second toga everywhere they went. But don't be fooled by the mythology. The Caesar family in 100 BC, while aristocratic in name, was decidedly middling in fortune. They were patricians, members of the old noble class, which meant they had centuries of prestige and tradition behind them. What they didn't have was much money. The family apartment in the Subura wasn't in the nice part of Rome. The Subura was the city's loudest, most chaotic neighborhood. It smelled of street food and commerce, and things that polite Roman society preferred not to discuss. Towering apartment buildings, called insulae, crammed thousands of residents into tight, noisy, often structurally questionable spaces. This is the neighborhood that made Julius Caesar. Not the temples on the Capitoline Hill, not the marble forums, the Subura, the street market, the noise. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a senator and a praetor, a respectable figure in Roman public life, but not a dominant one. He served, held offices, was known. He was not, by any measure, the kind of man you'd look at and think, that family is going to inherit the world. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, was by nearly every ancient account a formidable woman. Brilliant, highly educated by the standards of her time, and ferociously devoted to raising her son properly. The Roman sources that describe Aurelia tend toward a kind of awed respect that Roman writers didn't often give women. She was not merely a competent mother. She was a deliberate one. It was Aurelia who oversaw young Caesar's education personally, who selected his tutors, who instilled in him the Latin precision and Greek philosophy that would eventually make him one of the finest prose writers of the ancient world. She supervised his reading. She monitored his rhetoric. She made sure he understood from very young what his name was supposed to mean and what it would require of him to live up to it. Picture the young Caesar then, a skinny boy, reportedly, with what sources describe as a pale complexion and dark, lively eyes. He was said to be extraordinarily vain about his appearance even as a child. He fussed with his hair. He adjusted his clothes with unusual care. Later in life, when he began losing his hair, this would become a full-blown obsession. But we'll get there. What was childhood like for a boy of Caesar's background? If you were expecting a Roman version of an idyllic childhood, lower your expectations dramatically. Roman elite education was rigorous, relentless, and began early. By 6 or 7, Caesar would have started learning to read and write in both Latin and Greek. Not the simplified versions, the real ones. Rhetoric, logic, literature, philosophy. His first tutor was apparently a man named Marcus Antonius Gnipho, a Gaul by birth and a scholar by dedication, who taught Caesar the oratorical foundations he would later use to make his enemies feel very small indeed. Later, Caesar also studied under other teachers, absorbing the formal tradition of Roman rhetoric with the same intensity he brought to everything else. The speeches he would eventually give in the Roman Senate and the forums were not improvised. They were the product of decades of deliberate preparation, starting in a small room in the Suburra where a boy with restless eyes and his mother's ambition drilled the structures of argument into his memory, one sentence at a time. Roman boys of the aristocratic class also learned to ride, to fight, to swim, and to handle themselves physically. Caesar was by all accounts an excellent horseman throughout his life, reportedly capable of riding with his hands clasped behind his back in a demonstration of control that impressed soldiers decades later. He swam in campaigns when most generals would have found a boat. The physical discipline of his early years ran alongside the intellectual one. He also grew up watching politics, not from a distance, but from inside the house. His father's friends came for dinner. Senators visited. The gossip of the forum, who was ascending, who was falling, which alliance was forming and which was cracking. This was the dinner conversation of Caesar's childhood. He absorbed it the way children absorb the assumptions of their environment, unconsciously and completely. Caesar's childhood also introduced him early to Roman politics, because in Rome, politics wasn't something you observed from a distance. It came into the house. It sat at the dinner table. His uncle Gaius Marius was arguably the most famous general in Rome during Caesar's boyhood. 7 times consul, reformer of the entire Roman army, the man who opened military service to landless citizens and created the professional legions that would define Rome for centuries. Having Marius as your uncle was a bit like being a teenager whose father happened to rearrange the entire national military. You couldn't help absorbing some of it. And then, at 12 years old, Caesar's world narrowed suddenly. His father died. Dropped dead, the sources say, while putting on his shoes one morning. No dramatic battle, no political assassination. Just gone. Gaius Julius Caesar the elder, senator and father, was gone before breakfast. This left the family in a complicated position. Caesar was now technically the man of the household at 12 years old, with all the legal and social responsibilities that entailed in Roman society. His mother, Aurelia, managed the household finances with the kind of quiet steel that the sources hint she applied to most things. The family was not destitute, but they were no longer comfortable. The Suburra apartment remained home. The struggle remained real. What grief did young Caesar carry quietly through those years? The sources don't tell us. Romans of the upper class were not encouraged toward public emotional display. But we do know that Caesar carried his father's memory deliberately throughout his political career. He invoked it, he honoured it publicly, he built on it, and somewhere in those teenage years in the Suburra, in the noise and the heat and the smell of the street market, the ambition began. Chapter 2. The nephew of Marius, the enemy of Sulla. If Julius Caesar's childhood was complicated, his adolescence was genuinely dangerous, because Rome, in the years when Caesar was growing from a boy into a young man, became a city at war with itself. It started with his uncle. Gaius Marius, the great general and 7-time consul, was at the centre of a feud that split Roman society straight down the middle. His rival was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a brilliant, calculating aristocrat who believed that Marius and his political allies had hijacked the Republic. The feud between Marius and Sulla wasn't just personal, it was constitutional. It was about who controlled Rome, who controlled the armies, who had the right to command and reward and punish, and it turned violent in ways that shocked even Romans who thought they'd seen everything. In 88 BC, when Caesar was around 12 years old, Sulla did something that no Roman general had ever done before. He marched his army on Rome itself, the sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium, which Roman law forbade soldiers to cross in arms, meant nothing. To Sulla that day, he crossed it. He took the city. He posted lists of enemies, the famous proscriptions, and people on those lists found very quickly that Rome had become an extremely uncomfortable place to live. Marius fled. Then Sulla left to fight a war in the east. Then Marius came back with his own army, took Rome again, and his faction conducted its own round of purges. Then Marius died in 86 BC, leaving his allies scrambling for position. Then Sulla returned from the east in 83 BC and made the whole thing much worse. Caesar was navigating his teenage years against this backdrop of political purge and counter-purge. And just to make his situation more personally precarious, he had been given a prestigious religious appointment. At some point around 85 or 84 BC, Caesar was nominated as Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter. This was one of the most prestigious and most restrictive religious offices in all of Rome. The Flamen Dialis could not leave Rome for more than a night, could not touch iron, could not see an army, could not be away from his wife for more than 3 days. In short, it was a gilded cage, a magnificent one perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. And then Sulla came back, and everything changed. Sulla's return to Rome in 83 to 82 BC was followed by the most comprehensive political purge Rome had yet seen. Thousands of names went onto proscription lists. To be proscribed meant your property was seized, you lost all legal protection, and anyone who killed you was not just immune from punishment, but actually rewarded. It was state-sponsored assassination with a spreadsheet. Caesar's name was not on the list initially, but Caesar had connections that made him dangerously visible. His uncle Marius had been Sulla's great enemy. His wife Cornelia, whom he had married around 84 BC at roughly 16 years old, was the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, another of Sulla's chief opponents who was now conveniently dead. This marriage had made political sense when it was arranged. Now it made Caesar a target. Sulla, who had absolute power and was in no mood for sentiment, ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. Simple command: comply or face consequences. Caesar refused. Think about how remarkable this is. A teenager, essentially broke, with no army, no independent power base, in a city where the most powerful man alive was actively hostile toward him. And he said no. He would not divorce his wife to satisfy Sulla's political housekeeping. Sulla stripped Caesar of his priesthood, of his wife's dowry, of his modest inheritance. Caesar fled Rome, hiding in the countryside around the Sabine hills. moving from place to place while fevered with malaria, reportedly changing his hiding place every night because Sulla's agents were looking for him. His mother's family connections eventually opened a door to intercession. A delegation of Vestal virgins and relatives approached Sulla and pleaded for Caesar's life. Sulla apparently considered, then relented, but he was not happy about it. According to the ancient biographer Suetonius, Sulla said something that became famous. In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses. It was not a compliment. It was a warning. Sulla could see, even in this defiant teenager, something that other powerful men would also eventually see too late. Caesar was allowed to return. He kept his wife. He kept his life. But he was marked, and he knew it. And so, in the logical move of a young Roman with a dangerous profile and a restless intelligence, he left Rome entirely and went east to seek a military career. The further from Sulla, the better. He would not stay away forever. He never stayed anywhere forever. But for now, the Subura's most famous son walked out of Rome with nothing much to his name, heading east toward the province of Asia, and whatever fortune he could make with his own hands. Chapter 3. Pirates, Ransom, and Revenge. Best served cold Caesars. Years of early military service, roughly 81 to 78 BC, were spent in the eastern provinces, attaching himself to the military campaigns of Roman governors, learning the trade of war, earning a military decoration called the Corona Civica, which was essentially the Roman equivalent of the highest military honour, given for saving the life of a fellow citizen in battle. He won it at the siege of Mytilene. He was barely 20 years old. Then Sulla died in 78 BC. The boot lifted from Caesar's neck. He returned to Rome briefly, attempted to prosecute a Sullan loyalist for extortion, lost the case because the Roman judicial system was exactly as impartial as you'd expect, then left again for the east to study rhetoric on the island of Rhodes. Apparently, even at this stage, even in his mid-20s and already a veteran of military campaigning, Caesar felt his oratorical skills needed sharpening. The bar he was measuring himself against was that high. He never quite made it to Rhodes. In the Aegean Sea, somewhere around 75 BC, Caesar's ship was captured by pirates. Not metaphorical pirates, actual pirates of the Cilician variety, who at this period in history essentially ran a criminal enterprise across the entire eastern Mediterranean. They were bold enough to raid coastal towns, brazen enough to kidnap Roman citizens, and organized enough to negotiate ransoms. They captured Caesar and demanded a ransom. 20 talents of silver, a substantial sum. Caesar reportedly laughed at them. He told them they had no idea who they were dealing with. He told them that 20 talents was an insult. He demanded, as though he were in any position to demand anything, that they raise the ransom to 50 talents. The pirates were apparently confused enough by this behavior that they agreed. While his associates went to collect the ransom, Caesar spent approximately 40 days as a pirate captive, and by all accounts he spent those 40 days being extraordinarily irritating. He participated in the pirates' games and exercises. He wrote poetry and read them passages of it. When they didn't appreciate his literary efforts, he called them illiterates. He slept when he wanted to sleep, and when the noise kept him up, he sent messages asking the pirates to be quiet. He told them, repeatedly and apparently cheerfully, that after he was released he was going to come back, crucify every last one of them, and throw their bodies into the sea. The pirates thought this was hilarious. A captive Roman noble making threats from a position of total powerlessness. Very entertaining. Caesar was not joking. The ransom was paid. Caesar was released. He immediately went to the nearest port, gathered a small private fleet, returned to the pirate anchorage, and captured most of them. He took them to the local Roman governor, and requested that they be crucified. The governor, a man more interested in keeping the pirates' confiscated wealth for himself than in executing Justice dithered. Caesar went back to the anchorage, had the pirates crucified himself, all of them. He then, according to Suetonius, showed a small mercy that tells you something complicated about the kind of man he was. He had their throats cut first, so the crucifixion was quick rather than the prolonged suffering the punishment usually involved. He'd told them he was going to crucify them. He'd just neglected to specify that he would make it fast. This episode is often told as a charming anecdote, proof of Caesar's wit and nerve. But look at it more carefully, and what you see is a portrait of a man in his mid-20s who already had exactly one gear when it came to threats. He meant every single one he made. He followed through. The charm and the jokes and the poetry readings were all real. So was the follow-through. Rome found out about the pirate incident and smiled indulgently. A scrappy young nobleman showing characteristic Roman pluck. What they missed, what almost everyone would keep missing for the next 3 decades, was that the charm was not a distraction from the ruthlessness. The charm and the ruthlessness were the same thing wearing different masks. Chapter 4. The Long Climb Back in Rome. By 73 BC, Caesar began the slow, expensive, socially demanding process of Roman political advancement. The cursus honorum, the course of honours, was Rome's formal career ladder, a sequence of public offices you had to hold in order, at specific minimum ages, moving from quaestor to aedile to praetor to consul. Each step required winning elections. Winning elections required money, favours, connections, public visibility, and speeches. Lots and lots of speeches. Caesar had the connections through his family name and his Marian associations. He had the speeches because he was by now considered one of the finest orators in Rome. What he didn't have was money, and Roman politics in the late Republic ran on money the way a watermill runs on water, endlessly, hungrily, without pause. This is where Marcus Licinius Crassus enters the story. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, possibly the richest man in the known world. He had built his fortune through an astonishing variety of business ventures, the most famous being a private fire brigade. When a building in Rome caught fire, Crassus's men would arrive and offer to buy the building from the panicking owner at a fraction of its value. If the owner agreed, they'd put out the fire. If not, they stood and watched. This is either a story about entrepreneurship or about predatory capitalism, depending on your perspective. Either way, it made Crassus extraordinarily wealthy. He also invested in silver mines, trained artisans as slaves, and then rented them out, bought up land in newly conquered territories, and generally applied the same systematic exploitation to the entire Roman economy that he applied to burning buildings. He was not a warm person. He was an effective one. Crassus had been watching Caesar. He saw what Sulla had seen, a young man of unusual capability and unusual ambition, connected to the populist Marian tradition, beloved by the street-level voters of Rome, and blessed with a charisma that Crassus, who was by all accounts about as personable as a commercial transaction, profoundly lacked. Crassus began backing Caesar financially, not out of affection, out of calculation. You don't get as rich as Crassus without being good at calculating return on investment. Caesar's debts during this period were legendary. Not merely large. Legendary. The ancient sources speak of sums that should have destroyed any political career before it started. At one point, Caesar owed so much money to so many creditors that he allegedly joked he needed 2 successful conquests just to break even. Crassus at one stage guaranteed enormous debts on Caesar's behalf, simply to allow him to leave Rome for his Spanish posting without being physically detained by creditors, which was a real risk under Roman law. Caesar borrowed with spectacular confidence, as though he was absolutely certain that future victories would cover present obligations. This is either a mark of visionary self-belief or borderline financial recklessness. It may have been both, simultaneously, which seems appropriate for a man who spent his career treating apparent contradictions as perfectly comfortable places to live. In 68 BC, Caesar's wife Cornelia died. She had been with him through the Sullan crisis, through the poverty, through the pirate incident, through the years of scraping upward. He was 32 years old. At her funeral, he gave a public speech praising her. This was considered unusual. Public eulogy for women was not the Roman norm. Private grief was private. Caesar did it anyway, and delivered, by all accounts, something genuinely moving. Whatever his later reputation for cold calculation, the sources suggest something warmer when it came to the people he had genuinely loved early in his life. He also, at this same funeral, made a point of displaying the death masks of his Marian relatives, including Marius himself. In Sulla's Rome, this would have been suicidal provocation. In the Rome of 68 BC, with Sulla dead and his constitutional reforms already crumbling, and the popular faction reasserting itself, it was a political statement. Caesar was reminding the populace who he was and where he stood. He was a man of the people, connected to the great reformist tradition of Marius, and he was not going to pretend otherwise for the comfort of the conservative establishment. The following year, 67 BC, he married again, Pompeia, a granddaughter of Sulla. If you think this is politically baffling, given everything you just read about Caesar's relationship with Sulla's legacy, welcome to Caesar's entire career. He married into the enemy's family, absorbed their social connections, and did not blink. He continued climbing. Questor in 69 BC, aedile in 65 BC. As aedile, one of his main duties was organizing public entertainments, which meant gladiatorial shows, public feasts, dramatic productions, the entire circus and spectacle machinery that kept the Roman population distracted and invested in the Republic's social contract. Caesar organized these with such theatrical excess that he became, overnight, the most popular figure in the city. He also, more quietly, used the aedileship to restore the trophies and monuments of his uncle Marius that Sulla had torn down. This caused a brief political storm. It also confirmed to every Roman who was watching that Caesar was not simply a populist politician. He was a man with a program, a continuity, a deliberate ideological identity. Then, in 63 BC, came one of the most surprising elections in Roman history. Caesar ran for the position of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome, the head of the state religion. This was not normally a position that a 40-year-old politician with outstanding debts and a reputation for calculation stood any reasonable chance of winning. The position was traditionally held by men of the highest dignity and seniority. Caesar won it in a landslide. He was so confident he would win, or so convinced that losing would be the end of him, that he reportedly told his mother on the morning of the election that he would either come home as Pontifex Maximus or not come home at all. He came home as Pontifex Maximus. He moved his mother and the rest of the household into the official residence on the Via Sacra. He had, by the age of 40, done something remarkable. Despite starting with nothing but a name and an ambition too large for any sensible person to sustain, he had accumulated real institutional power. But the real test was still ahead, and it was coming from an unexpected direction. Chapter 5. The Scandal, the Alliance, and the Road to Spain, 63 BC, was the year of the Catilinarian conspiracy. Lucius Sergius Catilina, a bankrupt aristocrat with a talent for stirring up everyone who'd been squeezed out of the Republic's prosperity, attempted to organize an armed overthrow of the Roman government. The consul that year, Marcus Tullius Cicero, one of the greatest orators in Rome's history, and a man who viewed Caesar with a complicated mixture of admiration and deep suspicion, discovered the plot and had 5 of the conspirators executed without trial. Caesar, in the Senate debate over what to do with the conspirators, argued against summary execution. He proposed instead life imprisonment and confiscation of property. This was not a popular position in a Senate that was terrified and furious. Some Romans suspected Caesar of having sympathies with Catiline, or of playing a longer political game, protecting the populist tradition that Catiline had, however catastrophically attempted to channel. His speech was eloquent and careful. It didn't save the conspirators, but it saved Caesar from being tarred with Sulla's authoritarian brush. He could claim, later, that he had argued for due process in a moment when everyone else wanted blood. Then, in 62 BC, the scandal of the Bona Dea. The Bona Dea was a religious festival of great antiquity, held annually at the house of the Pontifex Maximus, attended exclusively by women, and absolutely forbidden to men under any circumstances. No male presence was permitted. It was one of Rome's most sacred and strictly maintained rituals. A young Roman nobleman named Publius Clodius Pulcher was found at the festival disguised as a woman. He had apparently, according to every gossiping Roman who commented on the incident, been attempting to visit Caesar's wife Pompeia, with whom he was rumoured to have an understanding of a particularly romantic variety. The scandal was immediate and total. Clodius was prosecuted for sacrilege. Caesar divorced Pompeia. When asked at the subsequent trial whether he had any evidence of his wife's involvement with Clodius, Caesar delivered one of the most famous one-liners in ancient history. He said that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, not that she was guilty, not that she was innocent, simply that the standard he held for anyone bearing his name was so high that even the suspicion of impropriety was enough to sever the connection. Clodius was acquitted. The jury was bribed spectacularly, but this whole affair created a complicated set of consequences. Caesar now had a powerful enemy in whoever had wanted Clodius convicted, and a complicated non-enemy in Clodius himself, who would later become, through the peculiar alchemy of Roman politics, an extremely useful ally. Caesar was elected praetor in 62 BC. He governed Spain as propraetor in 61 to 60 BC, and here, finally, away from Rome's political theatre, he could actually fight. Spain was magnificent for Caesar. He campaigned against resistant tribal populations in the west and northwest of the peninsula, with an energy and competence that impressed his soldiers and alarmed his enemies back in Rome. He won battles, he won the admiration of his troops. He accumulated enough wealth from the campaigns to begin paying off, in actual money for once, some of the colossal debts that had been following him around since his 20s. He was awarded upon his return a military triumph. He was also, while in Spain, said to have stood before a statue of Alexander the Great and wept. The story may be embellished, but the supposed reason for the weeping is perfect. Caesar was around 40 years old. Alexander had conquered most of the known world by 32. Caesar looked at Alexander's statue and thought, "What have I done with my time?" The man was not capable of being satisfied. It was possibly his most dangerous quality. Time equals quote 5 seconds, quote / greater than chapter 6. The first triumvirate Rome in 60 BC was in one of its periodic states of political dysfunction. 2 men dominated the landscape beyond all others, and they hated each other with the focused intensity that only truly ambitious people can sustain. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated military hero, the man who had cleared the entire Mediterranean of pirates in a matter of months, who had reorganized the entire eastern Mediterranean into Roman provinces and client states, who had returned from the east in 62 BC expecting a triumph, land for his veterans, and ratification of his eastern settlements. The Senate, led by the rigid constitutionalist Cato the Younger, refused him on essentially every point. Pompey was humiliated. His veterans were landless. His reorganization of the East was stalled in committee. He was enormous in reputation and helpless in domestic politics. Marcus Licinius Crassus, already introduced, the richest man, in Rome, currently furious because the Senate had also refused a tax contract renegotiation that his business associates in the East desperately needed. Crassus had enough money to buy the Senate several times over, but what he wanted was political respect, military glory, a legacy beyond being the man who owned Rome's fire brigades. And then there was Caesar, the rising populist politician, freshly returned from a successful Spanish campaign, prevented from seeking a triumph, and the consulship simultaneously by Senate rules that the Optimates were deploying like weapons. These three men looked at each other, recognized in each other both utility and danger, and made a private arrangement. They would support each other's interests. Pompey's veterans would get their land. Crassus's tax contract would get renegotiated. Caesar would get the consulship. This arrangement had no official name at the time. Later, historians called it the First Triumvirate, the Rule of Three. It was not a formal institution. It was a private deal among three men who collectively had enough money, enough military loyalty, and enough political reach to override the Senate when necessary. Caesar was elected consul for 59 BC. He arrived in office with an agenda, allies, and absolutely no patience for obstruction. His co-consul, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, was an Optimate loyalist who opposed virtually everything Caesar tried to do. Caesar's response to obstruction was to simply ignore Bibulus, carry his legislation to the popular assemblies directly, and when Bibulus attempted to halt proceedings through religious obstruction, essentially lock him out of the forum. Bibulus retreated to his house and spent the rest of the year issuing legal objections that Caesar ignored. Roman wags began dating documents not with the consular names of Caesar and Bibulus, but with Julius and Caesar, as though one man held both posts. He wasn't wrong about the power dynamic. Caesar passed the agrarian legislation that redistributed public land to Pompey's veterans. He renegotiated Crassus's tax contracts. He passed laws reducing corruption in provincial governance. He organized the eastern provinces along the lines Pompey had wanted. He married his daughter Julia to Pompey, cementing the alliance with family bonds, and he secured for himself, after his consulship ended, a 5-year command of the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and, when the governor died conveniently, Transalpine Gaul. He was going to war, and not just any war. He was going to a war that, if he managed it correctly, would make him rich enough to pay his debts, powerful enough to be untouchable, and famous enough to stand in front of Alexander's statue without feeling anything other than perfectly satisfied. He left Rome in 58 BC. He did not return for 9 years. Chapter 7. The Gallic Wars. What Caesar did in Gaul between 58 and 50 BC is, depending on who you ask, either the most remarkable military achievement in Roman history, or one of the most catastrophic acts of conquest ever visited upon a people. Both things are true simultaneously. Rome celebrated Caesar. The Gauls, those who survived, experienced something they didn't have adequate language for yet, which we would now call genocide. Caesar himself estimated in his own written account that 1 million Gauls died and another million were enslaved. Modern historians debate the precise numbers, but not the general scale. Caesar wrote about all of it himself. The Commentari de Bello Gallico, the Gallic War Commentaries, 7 books covering 7 years of campaigning, are one of the great works of Latin prose. Clear, precise, written in the third person, as though Caesar were a detached historian, observing his own campaigns rather than the man giving the orders. They are propaganda, polished to the point of near transparency. They are also, stripped of their self-serving framing, genuinely extraordinary history. The campaign began almost immediately with strategic justification. A Helvetian tribe, the Helvetii, were migrating through Roman territory. Caesar moved to block them, then he crushed them and forced them back to their homeland. Then the Germanic chieftain Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine and established himself in Gallic territory, became the next problem. Caesar defeated him too, in a battle that reportedly terrified even Caesar's veteran soldiers, until he personally took a shield from a fleeing standard-bearer and marched to the front rank. This small detail recurs several times in Caesar's career, the general who won't let the fear of his soldiers go unchallenged, who takes a shield and walks forward and makes the panic shameful by comparison with his calm. It worked every time. The logistics of these campaigns were staggering. Caesar was moving multiple legions, each of 8,000 to 10,000 men, plus cavalry, supply trains, engineers, and the auxiliary forces of allied Gallic tribes, across hundreds of miles of territory, with no infrastructure, no reliable maps, and supply chains that depended on what could be foraged, commandeered, or transported before the weather changed. He built roads, he built bridges, he built camps, proper fortified camps, every single night, a standard that Roman military doctrine required, and that Caesar enforced with the discipline of a man who understood that carelessness at the end of a long march was exactly when an enemy struck. He fought in Belgium, in Normandy, on the coast where the Atlantic surf terrified Italian soldiers who had never seen such ocean. He fought the Veneti tribe at sea, a naval battle for which his fleet had to be purpose-built on the Loire River and sailed north. He crossed to Britain in 55 BC with 2 legions and not nearly enough cavalry, ran into late-season storms that wrecked many of his ships, fought several engagements, and came back to Gaul without having conquered anything in particular, but having crossed the Channel. The following year he came back with 5 legions and more cavalry, penetrated deeper into the island, received the nominal submission of a British king and returned, again, still without making Britain a province, but having been there twice when no Roman general had ever managed it at all. Back in Gaul, the wars deepened. The Belgic tribes of the north were among the fiercest opponents. The Nervi attacked Caesar's column while it was building camp, catching his legions in a moment of partial construction when they had set down their weapons. Caesar personally ran to the front lines, sword in hand, to steady his soldiers. The Nervi were broken so completely that of their reported fighting force of over 60,000 warriors, the survivors could fit in a single meeting place. The details of individual campaigns tell you everything you need to know about Caesar's military genius. At the Battle of the Sabis River, his army was ambushed by the Nervi tribe, one of the fiercest peoples in Gaul, in a position of serious disadvantage. The legions, caught while setting up camp, struggled to form coherent battle lines. Caesar reported later that he took a shield from a passing soldier and ran to the front line because the soldiers needed to see him. He moved along the line, shouting orders, adjusting formations, refusing to let the situation become rout. The battle turned. The Nervi were destroyed so completely that their tribe was reduced from a fighting force of 60,000 warriors to 500. In 52 BC came the greatest crisis of the entire war. A Gaul of the Arverni tribe named Vercingetorix rose up and did something no previous Gallic leader had managed. He united. For the first time in the wars, Caesar faced not a collection of individual tribes, but a coordinated Gallic resistance with a single military mind directing it. Vercingetorix was young, charismatic, tactically sophisticated, and he chose exactly the right strategy. He would not fight Caesar's legions in open battle where Roman discipline would win. He would draw them across a winter landscape, burn supplies before Caesar could reach them, harass with cavalry, starve the Romans out. He burned his own towns rather than let Caesar's army winter in them. The Gauls put the torch to places they had built and loved, granaries full of a year's food, workshops, homes, because Vercingetorix understood that feeding Caesar's army was more dangerous than destroying their own comfort. This was a level of strategic discipline that the Roman sources, even Caesar's own account, acknowledge with something approaching respect. Vercingetorix wasn't fighting like a barbarian chieftain seeking glory in single combat. He was fighting like a general who had studied the problem. It nearly worked. Caesar found himself in deep winter, short of supplies, unable to force a decisive engagement, his cavalry being whittled away by Vercingetorix's superior Gallic horsemen in the open country between forests. He requested German mercenary cavalry from across the Rhine, which he deployed with considerable effectiveness. But the strategic situation remained difficult. Vercingetorix was winning by not losing. Every day Caesar couldn't force battle was a day Caesar's army was weakening on inadequate supplies in hostile winter terrain. And then Vercingetorix made one mistake. After a partially successful cavalry engagement in which Caesar's German mercenaries managed to rout the Gallic horse and threaten the main Gallic force, Vercingetorix retreated into the hilltop fortress of Alesia, a massively fortified town on a plateau surrounded by river valleys and steep slopes. He believed a relief army was coming. He intended to hold the fortress while the relief army hit Caesar from outside. Caesar would be caught between hammer and anvil. What followed was one of the most extraordinary engineering feats in military history. Caesar, facing this situation, did not retreat. He built a siege line around Alesia, 11 miles of walls, ditches filled with sharpened stakes, towers every 80 feet, water obstacles of logs driven into channels to break cavalry charges. This circumvallation took shape in days of relentless work by 10 legions of soldiers who understood that their survival depended on finishing it before the relief army arrived. Then the Gallic relief army arrived. 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, according to Caesar's account, though modern scholars debate the precise figure. They attacked from outside, while Vercingetorix attacked from inside. Caesar's forces were sandwiched, so Caesar built a second wall facing outward. 13 more miles of fortification, the contravallation. His army, roughly 50,000 men, now held a corridor between two sets of walls, defending simultaneously against attack from both directions, unable to retreat because there was nowhere to retreat to. They held. 3 major assaults over several days. Caesar rode along his lines, recognizable by his red cloak, moving to wherever the pressure was greatest. At one critical moment, when the outer wall was about to break under a massive Gallic assault on its most vulnerable section, Caesar personally led a relief force to that point, his red cloak visible from distance, so that his soldiers could see him coming and the Gauls could see what was bearing down on them. The Gallic relief army broke. Vercingetorix surrendered. He rode down from Alesia in his finest armour, circled Caesar's camp on horseback in a formal act of submission, dismounted before Caesar's tribunal, removed his armour and weapons and sat at Caesar's feet. He was taken prisoner. He would spend 6 years in a Roman dungeon, largely forgotten, before being brought back to Rome for Caesar's triumph and executed in the customary fashion at the triumph's conclusion. He was perhaps 30 years old when he died. What did the Gallic Wars make Caesar? Rich, beyond any previous reckoning. The slaves and plunder from 8 years of Gallic campaigning were enormous. His soldiers were loyal in the particular deep way that soldiers become loyal to a commander who has led them through impossible things and somehow brought most of them home. He was famous across the entire Roman world, in a way that even Pompey's reputation could no longer match. He had won the greatest series of campaigns since Alexander, and he had 10 battle-hardened legions at his back who had built walls around hilltop fortresses in winter and held them against overwhelming numbers and trusted him to appear in his red cloak at exactly the right moment. Chapter 8. The Edge of the Law. While Caesar was conquering Gaul, Rome was coming apart. The first triumvirate, that private agreement among 3 powerful men, was fraying in ways that would prove fatal. In 54 BC, Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. The child did not survive either. This was not simply a personal tragedy. Julia had been a genuine bond between her father and her husband, a woman by all ancient accounts genuinely beloved by both men, and her death removed the human thread that had held the alliance together through 5 years of political strain. Pompey grieved publicly. Caesar received the news in Gaul and grieved privately, in whatever way Caesar grieved. Then, in 53 BC, Crassus died. He had gotten his war finally in the east against the Parthian Empire. He had marched into Mesopotamia with an enormous army and impeccable confidence. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians had done to Crassus what Crassus should perhaps have feared more. They had used cavalry and arrows and tactical patience against a Roman infantry force that had no answer for any of it. Crassus and his son died. Most of his army died or was captured. The Roman eagle standards, the sacred symbols of the legions, were taken by Parthia. It was Rome's most catastrophic military defeat in generations. The man who had funded Caesar's early career, who had served as the financial and political ballast in the triumvirate, was gone, and with him the last mediating force between Caesar and Pompey. In Rome, the political situation had deteriorated badly. Gang violence between factions had made normal Senate business intermittently impossible. Clodius Pulcher, the man of the Bonadea scandal, had become the leader of a street-level political mob that terrorized the Forum. A rival mob operated on behalf of the Optimate faction. The year 52 BC saw Clodius murdered on the Appian Way by the supporters of his rival Milo. His body was carried to the Senate House. His supporters burned the building down around him. In this chaos, Pompey was appointed sole consul. This was itself constitutionally unprecedented, a consul without colleague. It lasted long enough for Pompey to restore order, and in doing so, Pompey made his position clear. He was not the Marian populist he had once seemed. He was the guardian of the Republic, and the Republic, as interpreted by Cato and the Optimates, wanted Julius Caesar prosecuted. The issue was legal and pointed. Caesar's proconsular command in Gaul gave him immunity from prosecution while he held it. The moment he returned to Rome as a private citizen, the moment he crossed back into Italy without his command, he became legally vulnerable. His enemies, and there were many, intended to prosecute him for his actions as consul in 59 BC, which they claimed had been unconstitutional and illegal. Conviction would mean exile, disgrace, the end of everything. Caesar's solution was elegant and constitutionally arguable. He wanted to stand for the consulship of 48 BC in absentia, remaining in his province with his command and his immunity while running for the next office that would protect him. Precedent existed for this in Roman law, or could be argued to exist. It was not an outrageous demand. But the men who controlled the Senate in 50 BC were not in the business of doing Caesar favours. The negotiations dragged through 50 BC with increasing bitterness. Caesar's tribune Mark Curio, one of his most skillful political operators, proposed in the Senate that both Caesar and Pompey lay down their commands simultaneously. This was widely popular with ordinary Romans, who were exhausted by the prospect of civil war, and simply wanted the 2 largest armies in the world pointed at something other than each other. The Senate voted on Curio's proposal. 370 senators voted for it. 22 voted against. The will of the Senate was clear. The will of the consul and of Pompey and of Cato was clearer. The proposal was killed. The negotiations collapsed. By December of 50 BC, both sides were maneuvering as though war was inevitable, because it was. Caesar moved his army toward the Italian border. Pompey received a command to defend Rome. Legions were placed at Pompey's disposal that had originally been Caesar's own, stripped from him on the pretext of reinforcing the East. On the first day of January 49 BC, the Senate passed a final ultimatum. Caesar's tribunes vetoed it. The tribunes were driven from the Senate House by threat of force, their sacrosanct constitutional status overridden by raw intimidation. They fled to Caesar. Caesar looked at the Rubicon River, that small stream that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper. He is reported to have paused, to have discussed the decision with his officers, to have gone back and forth in the way that someone making an irreversible choice might reasonably do. Then he committed. Caesar looked at the situation. He looked at the Rubicon River, the small stream that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper. Roman law forbade a general to cross that boundary with his army under arms. It was the line, the absolute line. He crossed it. On the night of January 10th or 11th, 49 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar led one legion, the 13th, across the Rubicon River into Italy. And with that crossing, the Roman Republic entered its final chapter. The phrase Caesar is supposed to have spoken as he crossed is famous. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. The game is committed. Whatever is going to happen now is going to happen, and no amount of hesitation or caution or negotiation can unwind it. He walked into the river and kept walking. Chapter 9. Civil War. If Pompey and the Senate had expected that crossing the Rubicon would end Caesar's career, they had badly misunderstood the man they were dealing with. They also, it became clear with alarming speed, had badly misunderstood the loyalty of the Italian population and the effectiveness of the forces they had assembled to stop him. Caesar moved through Italy with one legion and the overwhelming weight of his reputation. Town after town opened its gates. The populace, tired of a decade of political dysfunction and responsive to the Marian populist identity Caesar had been cultivating for 20 years, did not resist. They watched him come, calculated which way the wind was blowing, and stood aside. The towns of Ariminum, Pisaurum, Fanum, Ancona, and Arretium all fell to Caesar within days, opening a wide path southward through Italy without a single battle. Pompey retreated to Brundisium, and then, when Caesar's advance left no other option, evacuated to Greece. He took with him most of the Senate, the conservative aristocracy, and the republican cause. He left Italy to Caesar. The speed of this retreat surprised everyone. Pompey's troops were adequate, his position defensible, his reputation enormous. But he chose to withdraw rather than contest Italy, intending to gather his eastern resources and return with overwhelming force. It was strategically defensible. It looked, from Rome's streets, like flight. Caesar, upon taking Rome without a single major battle in Italy, went not to celebrate but to work. He opened the treasury, though the treasury guardians had fled with Pompey, and he had to break the seals himself, which was technically illegal, and which he noted in writing, as if documenting his own transgression for the historical record. He met with the Senate. He was deliberately, pointedly merciful to those who submitted to him. He had crafted a political philosophy of clementia, mercy, leniency toward enemies who surrendered or switched sides. It was both genuine humanist principle and brilliant strategy. Every enemy spared was a potential ally. Every mercy shown was propaganda that read, "Caesar is not Sulla. Caesar is not a butcher. Caesar is the man who restores rather than destroys. The contrast with Sulla was deliberate and constant. Sulla had proscribed, Caesar pardoned. Sulla had killed senators and seized their property. Caesar invited senators back to Rome and returned their estates. This wasn't weakness. It was a different calculation about what power required in the aftermath of civil conflict. Sulla had ruled through terror, and it had produced a generation of trauma and instability. Caesar intended to rule through consent, through the appearance of legitimacy, through the image of a man so confident in his position that he could afford to be generous. Whether the clementia was sincere or calculated, whether Caesar was genuinely a merciful man or a man who had decided mercy was his most effective instrument, is one of those questions about him that the ancient sources muddy rather than clarify. The answer is probably that it was both simultaneously, which is a very human thing to be. At Pharsalus in Thessaly, in August of 48 BC, the decisive battle of the civil war was fought. Caesar was outnumbered. His men were tired and underfed after a difficult siege campaign at Dyrrhachium, where Pompey had actually forced Caesar back, one of the rare reverses of his career. By every rational calculation, this was the battle Caesar should have avoided. Pompey's cavalry was vastly superior, 3,700 to Caesar's 1,000. His infantry outnumbered Caesar's heavily. Pompey's senatorial advisors were so confident of victory that they were already arguing about the appointments and offices they would distribute after the battle. Caesar had anticipated the cavalry attack. He took 6 cohorts from his third line, his reserve, and placed them behind his right flank at an angle, hidden from Pompey's view by the normal battle formation. These men were given unusual orders. When the Pompeian cavalry charged, they were not to throw their javelins and retreat. They were to advance, hold their javelins as pikes, and aim for the faces of the horsemen. Caesar reportedly told them that Pompey's cavalry were young aristocrats who cared about their looks, and that a threat to their faces would break them faster than any other tactic. Whether he actually said this or whether the sources are embellishing, the tactic itself was brilliant and worked exactly as planned. The Pompeian cavalry rode into the hidden cohorts, found themselves facing infantry fighting upward at their faces in close quarters, and broke. The entire flank crumbled. Caesar's own cavalry pursued. The Pompeian flanks were exposed. Caesar committed his third line. The battle became a rout. Pompey fled. He went to Egypt, seeking refuge from the boy king Ptolemy XIII and his advisors. They murdered Pompey on the beach. They brought his head to Caesar. Caesar, by the accounts of the ancient sources, wept. He had wanted to capture Pompey, to show him the mercy he showed everyone, to use clementia as the political instrument it had become for him. He did not want Pompey dead. Dead, Pompey could not be grateful. Dead, Pompey was a martyr. Dead, Pompey was a complication. Caesar turned away from the severed head and reportedly cried. Then he went ashore in Egypt and walked into the next thing. Chapter 10. Egypt, Cleopatra, and the East Egypt in 48 BC was in the middle of its own civil war. The boy king Ptolemy XIII and his sister and co-ruler Cleopatra VII were at war with each other for control of the kingdom. Cleopatra had been expelled from Alexandria. Ptolemy controlled the city and the court. Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly after Pompey's murder. He was greeted with a severed head and expected to be grateful. He wasn't. He established himself in the royal palace and summoned both Ptolemy and Cleopatra to appear before him as the representative of Rome, which had extensive claims on Egypt by virtue of the fact that Egypt owed Rome enormous amounts of money and had been a Roman client state in everything but name for decades. Cleopatra, who was not in a position to simply walk through the front gate of a city her brother controlled, arranged to be smuggled into the palace in what the ancient sources variously describe as a rolled carpet, a sack, or a linen bag. The exact receptacle is debated. The image remains one of history's most dramatic entrances. She met Caesar. Caesar was 52. Cleopatra was 21. Caesar was arguably the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra was a woman who spoke 9 languages, had been educated as both a ruler and a scholar, was deeply committed to her kingdom's independence and prosperity, and understood immediately that the Roman general in the palace was the most important man she had ever met and might ever meet. What exactly passed between them that night, the ancient sources are coy about in the way that ancient sources about such matters generally are. But by the following morning, they were clearly allied, romantically, diplomatically, and strategically. Caesar supported Cleopatra's restoration as co-ruler of Egypt. Ptolemy's court responded by essentially trapping Caesar in Alexandria. What followed was months of siege warfare in a city Caesar hadn't planned to fight in, culminating in the burning of part of the famous Library of Alexandria, a casualty of the fire set during the harbour fighting that Caesar always seemed faintly embarrassed about in the sources, and the drowning of young Ptolemy XIII in the Nile during the eventual defeat of his forces. Cleopatra became sole ruler of Egypt, nominally co-ruling with another younger brother who died of causes the sources don't over-explain. Caesar stayed in Egypt for months, long enough for Cleopatra to become pregnant. His son, Caesarion, was born in 47 BC, after Caesar had finally left. He had other wars to fight. A king in Pontus named Pharnaces II had taken advantage of Rome's civil war distraction to reclaim territories his father Mithridates had once held. Caesar marched against him, caught him at the Battle of Zela, and won so quickly and so completely that he sent Rome the most economical military dispatch in history. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. 3 words. That was the battle report. Then North Africa, where the remaining Pompeian forces had regrouped under Cato's leadership. The Battle of Thapsus in 46 BC ended them. Cato, who had spent his entire career arguing for the Republic's preservation against men exactly like Caesar, and who would not submit and would not accept Caesar's famous mercy, locked himself in his room and arranged his own end with the rigorous self-discipline he applied to everything. He was found the following morning. He had not died easily, the sources suggest, but he had died on his own terms. Caesar reportedly said that he could not forgive Cato for denying him the opportunity to show mercy. It's a strange thing to say, but it tells you a great deal about what Caesar understood about the politics of clementia. Cato's death, on his own terms, was the last act of a man refusing to be incorporated into Caesar's narrative. Caesar had wanted to pardon him. Cato had chosen to be unbothered by Caesar's pardon. In death, Cato won, then Spain again in 45 BC, where Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus had raised new forces. The Battle of Munda was the hardest battle Caesar ever fought. He admitted afterward that he had fought for his life at Munda, which from Caesar was an extraordinary concession. The Pompeian forces were finally broken. Gnaeus was killed. Sextus escaped to fight another day, a complication Rome would deal with after Caesar was gone. Caesar returned to Rome in the autumn of 45 BC. The civil wars were over. He had won all of them. He was 55 years old and the unchallenged master of the Roman world. Now came the hardest part. Chapter 11. Dictator Rome had a tradition of dictatorship, not in the modern pejorative sense, but as a specific constitutional office, held in emergencies for a maximum of 6 months, with extraordinary powers to restore order. Sulla had held it. Other Romans had held it. The dictator was supposed to step down when the crisis ended. Caesar was appointed dictator multiple times and for increasingly long terms. In 44 BC, he was appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. This had never happened before. Dictator in perpetuity was, in substance if not in name, a monarch. And the word monarch in Rome was as toxic as any word in the political vocabulary. Romans, or at least the Romans who mattered in the Senate and the upper classes, had expelled their last king approximately 5 centuries earlier and never forgotten it. They had constructed an entire civic identity around the idea of the Republic, government by and through the people and their elected representatives, as opposed to rule by one man. The Republic was the civic religion. The res publica, the public thing, the shared commonwealth, was what made Rome Rome. Kings were the past. Kings were tyranny. Kings were exactly what the ancestors had died to prevent. And here was Caesar, accumulating powers that looked, from certain angles, indistinguishable from monarchy. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate rather than the magistrate's bench. He received ambassadors while seated, which Roman protocol said you did not do unless you were a king. He was receiving divine honours, his statue placed in temples alongside the gods, his birthday marked as a public holiday, sacrifices made in his name. He was appointed to control all Roman provinces and all Roman armies simultaneously. He wore the red leather boots that had once been the symbol of the old Alban kings. He dressed in the purple-bordered toga of the old Roman triumphal costume, wearing it not just during ceremonial events but as daily dress. The Senate responded to all of this by giving him more honours, more titles, more powers. It is worth pausing on this because it seems bizarre. These were the men who would later claim he had to die for the Republic's sake. But they were also the men giving him increasingly extravagant powers in the months before the Ides. This apparent contradiction makes more sense when you understand the dynamic. Some senators were genuine admirers. Others were terrified and performing loyalty. Others were calculating, building up credit with a man who seemed unchallengeable, keeping their options open. And a few, a significant few, were watching the accumulation of powers with growing horror and waiting for the right moment, the right allies, the right pretext. Caesar knew he was generating this anxiety. He made statements that seemed designed to reassure, claiming he cared more about the Republic's welfare than his own life. He ostentatiously rejected the title of Rex King when people in crowds shouted it at him. But his actions and the action's trajectory told a different story than his words. And in Rome, people who had spent their careers learning to read the distance between what powerful men said and what they did were very good at that reading. And then there was the crown. In February of 44 BC, at the Lupercalia festival, Mark Antony, Caesar's close ally and most flamboyant supporter, offered Caesar a royal diadem. The ancient sources describe what followed in slightly different terms, but the general shape is consistent. Caesar declined the crown. The crowd cheered. Antony offered it again. Caesar declined again. More cheering. Was this theatre staged to demonstrate that Caesar didn't want to be king? Was Antony testing the crowd's reaction? Was Caesar genuinely undecided? Historians have argued about it for 2,000 years. What we know is that the scene made the people who were already worried about Caesar considerably more worried. In his last months, Caesar was planning wars that dwarfed anything he had done in Gaul. A campaign against the Parthians to avenge Crassus and reclaim the lost eagles was being assembled. He had appointed his great-nephew Gaius Octavius as his heir, though this was not yet known widely. He was reorganizing the provinces, sending colonies of Roman citizens to Carthage and Corinth. He was reforming the calendar, an act of such lasting significance that the Julian calendar remained in use across Europe for 15 centuries. He was, by every measure, governing, not just holding power, but actually using it to reform, to build, to project Rome's reach further than it had ever reached. But in the Senate, in the conversations held in the baths and the gardens and the private homes of Rome's upper class, a different calculation was being made. Chapter 12. The Ides of March. The conspiracy came together over the winter of 45 to 44 BC. The men who organized it were not, or not mostly, the remnants of the Pompeian cause. Many of them were Caesar's own men, his allies, his appointees. Marcus Junius Brutus was the son of a woman Caesar had almost certainly loved, Servilia, and was widely rumoured, then and now, to be Caesar's illegitimate son. Caesar had pardoned him after Pharsalus, promoted him, made him praetor. Brutus was deeply committed to the Stoic philosophical tradition in which civic duty and the Republic's health took precedence over personal loyalty. Gaius Cassius Longinus, Brutus's brother-in-law, was a brilliant military man with grievances both ideological and personal. He and Caesar had been rivals for certain appointments. He was, by temperament and conviction, a republican in the old Catonian mode. There were about 60 men in the conspiracy, which in retrospect is a remarkable number to keep secret. They called themselves the Liberatores. They wanted to liberate Rome from tyranny, to restore the Republic, to remove the man who had, in their view, made the Republic's institutions hollow theatre. Caesar knew he was in danger. He had been told. His wife Calpurnia, his third and final wife, whom he had married in 59 BC and remained married to until the end, had dreamed of his murder. An astrologer or soothsayer named Spurina had warned him specifically to beware the Ides of March, the 15th day of that month. The warning had been delivered and noted. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar was due to attend a meeting of the Senate at the Theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was temporarily meeting because their own building was under reconstruction. His bodyguard of Spanish soldiers had recently been dismissed. He had made a public point of not fearing assassination. It was a posture he had maintained for years, the invincible confidence of a man who had survived too much to believe an ordinary knife could end him. He had said explicitly that he would rather die than live in fear. He had said that a quick death was preferable to a life spent looking over his shoulder. Romans of the upper class said this kind of thing. It sounded stoic, dignified. Whether Caesar fully believed it or was simply performing the appropriate attitude is impossible to know. What we know is that he had dismissed the people whose job was to ensure that the attitude remained theoretical. He was not feeling well that morning. The sources speak of bad omens and Calpurnia's terror and Caesar's own uncertainty. Calpurnia, who is by every account a woman of great steadiness, had dreamed something that left her shaking. She had seen in the dream what the ancient sources variously describe as the destruction of their house or Caesar's body in her arms. She begged him not to go. She asked him to postpone. She was not a superstitious woman, the sources suggest, which is part of why her fear that morning was so striking. Caesar wavered. He sent word that he was unwell and would not attend. He may have genuinely been in one of the episodes of illness, possibly epileptic, that the sources mention through his life. Decimus Brutus arrived at his house. Decimus Brutus was not the famous Brutus of the assassination story. He was a different man, one of Caesar's most trusted and decorated commanders. He had served with distinction in Gaul. Caesar had trusted him with significant commands. He was also one of the conspirators, one of the men who had spent the winter quietly spreading the plot through the Senate's most principled and disaffected members. He came to Caesar's door that morning and persuaded him to come. He argued that the Senate was assembled, that Postponing again would look weak and ill, that the senators who had honoured Caesar with new powers deserved the courtesy of his presence. He may also have suggested that the men planning to offer some particular honour that day would be insulted by his absence. Caesar went. The conspirators had arranged themselves around him as the meeting began. The theatre of Pompey's meeting hall gave them cover, a crowd of senators among whom men with weapons could stand close without immediate suspicion. One senator, Julius Caesar, approached with a petition for his brother's recall from exile. As Caesar took the document, Caesar grabbed his toga and pulled it down from his shoulder, a gesture that was the signal. The first blade was produced. The first wound, a shallow cut in the neck, came from Casca. Caesar grabbed Casca's arm. He used the kind of Latin you don't hear in formal speeches. He was surprised, and then, in the space of seconds, he was surrounded. They all came at once, senators, producing daggers from under their togas. The ancient sources differ slightly on what happened next, on whether Caesar fought, on whether he covered his face immediately with his toga, or only toward the end, on whether he recognized Brutus among the men striking him, and what, if anything, he said when he did. Shakespeare's famous words, et tu, Brute, are Shakespeare's. Suetonius writes that some sources recorded Caesar speaking a Greek phrase to Brutus at the moment of recognition, which is sometimes translated as "you too, child." Whether he said this or nothing at all, the recognition of a man he had trusted, had pardoned, had promoted among the faces bearing weapons must have been its own particular wound beyond the physical ones. 23 wounds. That is the number the ancient sources give. The Senate House emptied as quickly as you would expect, when what had been a meeting suddenly became something else. Conspirators scattered, senators who had known nothing of the plot, and man who had defeated Pompey in battle, 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 who had defeated man, who had defeated Pompey in battle, who had outlived him, who had wept at his severed head, ended his last moment at the marble feet of the man he had beaten. This detail is almost certainly true because it was immediately observed and immediately circulated. No one would have invented it. History doesn't normally arrange its ironies this neatly, but occasionally it does. 3 of his household slaves came eventually and carried his body home in a litter. The most powerful man in the world carried home through the streets of Rome 3 slaves, 1 litter. Chapter 13. The Aftermath. The conspirators had a plan. What they did not have was a plan for what came after. The assassination of Julius Caesar on March 15th, 44 BC, was one of history's most precisely targeted failures. The liberatores had removed the man. They had done nothing to remove the conditions that had made the man, and they had not counted on what the man had built, the machinery of loyalty and resentment, an organized political force that outlived him by decades. They rushed to the forum. Brutus gave a speech. The crowd was quiet, not enthusiastic. The conspirators had not, in the weeks before March 15th, bothered to secure the support of the legions, the treasury, the provinces, or even most of Rome's population. They had assumed that the act of removing the tyrant would be so obviously just that the Republic would simply reassemble itself around the vacancy. They assumed the institutions were still there, waiting, dormant rather than dead. They were wrong. The institutions had hollowed out over decades of civil conflict and factional violence. What remained were habits and names. The substance had been Caesar. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally and co-consul, was alive and at large. He had been prevented from entering the Senate House on the day of the assassination by a collaborating conspirator who engaged him in conversation outside. He had survived, which the conspirators had expected. What they had not fully reckoned with was the combination of Antony's political instincts and Caesar's will. At Caesar's funeral, Antony read the will aloud. He displayed the toga Caesar had died in, holding it up before the crowd with the wound marks visible. He enumerated the bequests. 300 sesterces to every citizen of Rome. Caesar's gardens on the Janiculum opened as a public park, and then Antony, who was an orator of considerable force when occasion demanded it, spoke. The ancient sources differ on precisely what he said and how he said it, but they agree on what it did. The mood in the forum shifted, then cracked, then broke. Riots followed. The houses of some conspirators were attacked. A poet named Cinna, who had the misfortune of sharing a name with one of the conspirators, though he was himself innocent, was caught by a mob and didn't survive the confusion. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome within weeks. They had won the battle of the Senate chamber and lost the war of the streets. Across the Adriatic, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew Gaius Octavius was studying in Macedonia when he received word of the assassination and the discovery in Caesar's will that he had been adopted as Caesar's son and primary heir. He crossed to Italy with a small retinue and almost no money. He was slight, fair-haired, reportedly not physically impressive. No one looking at him in 44 BC would have predicted what he was about to do. He collected Caesar's soldiers, made himself acceptable to Caesar's veterans, and began the patient process of positioning himself as Caesar's true heir and avenger. He took the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He was 17 years old and already more dangerous than anyone around him fully understood. He would eventually become Augustus the First. Liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the republic that the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was the liberatores had killed Caesar to save was buried with him, and the empire that rose from the rubble was the architecture that would define Western civilization for 500 more years. Chapter 14. What was Julius Caesar? History doesn't settle neatly on Julius Caesar, it never has. 2,000 years of readers, writers, politicians, generals, and ordinary curious people have looked at this man and seen different things in him, and all of them were probably right. Was he a democrat or a demagogue? He fought his entire career on the side of the populares, the popular faction, against the entrenched interests of the Senate aristocracy. He distributed land to veterans. He passed laws against provincial corruption. He was genuinely beloved by the Roman poor and by his soldiers. But he also dismantled the institutional checks that protected popular power, concentrated authority in himself, and left behind a world where emperors rather than assemblies decided Roman life for the next 5 centuries. He freed the people from the Senate's stranglehold and placed them under an emperor's. Whether that was liberation or substitution, reasonable people disagreed then and disagree now. Was he a great general? Unambiguously. The flexibility of his tactical thinking, the engineering competence of his campaigns, the physical courage he showed at moments of crisis, the relationship he maintained with his soldiers, the ability to improvise in real time under conditions that would have paralyzed most commanders. He was not perfect. Kari taught Rome that even the best plans fail when logistics are ignored, though that was Crassus's disaster rather than his. But on the field, in the series of wars from Gaul to Spain to Africa to Greece, his record stands comparison with anyone who ever commanded an army in the ancient world. Was he a good man? Here the question becomes genuinely hard. 1 million Gauls died or were enslaved. He calculated and executed this conquest with full knowledge of its human cost, and the commentarii, that brilliant piece of propaganda, are partly designed to make that cost seem inevitable and even virtuous. He was capable of extraordinary personal mercy, the clementia that defined his civil war, while simultaneously conducting wars of conquest, whose scale of human destruction was enormous. He loved his daughter genuinely. He was, by Roman standards of the time, fair to his wives. He maintained friendships with unexpected loyalty. He was also ruthlessly willing to use, betray, and discard people when the political calculation required it. He wrote beautifully. The Gallic War Commentaries, those 7 books of precise, almost cinematically clear Latin prose written in the third person, are considered masterworks of the language. Caesar wrote about himself as if he were a general he was observing from a respectful distance, which is both technically impressive and slightly unsettling. He also wrote poetry, 2 books of it, which Augustus later suppressed, and we have never recovered. He wrote a grammatical treatise on the Latin language. He wrote speeches that Cicero, who despised Caesar's politics and loved his prose, praised as models of eloquence. He was not merely a man of action who happened to write clearly. He was a writer of the first rank who happened also to be a general and a politician. He could sleep on horseback. He dictated letters to multiple secretaries simultaneously, riding through Gaul on campaign with one man taking down correspondence to Rome, another to allies, another to provincial governors, all at once, all in his own precise Latin, none of it confused or duplicated. He reportedly memorized the name of every soldier in his legions, at least according to the admiring ancient sources, which may be exaggeration but probably captures something real about the attention he paid to the men under his command. He was an epileptic. The sources call it the falling sickness, and mention episodes during campaigns that he managed with characteristic refusal to let inconvenient physical realities alter his plans. His enemies whispered about it. His soldiers knew about it, and apparently it didn't diminish their loyalty in the slightest. A general who had episodes of this kind, and still marched them across Europe to victory, was perhaps more impressive to soldiers, not less. He was losing his hair from at least his 30s onward, and this distressed him enormously. He combed what remained forward from the back of his head in an arrangement that soldiers teased him about with the kind of affection you only extend to someone you'd follow across the Rhine twice. He reportedly valued the right to wear the laurel wreath, given to victorious generals, partly because it covered the thinning hair. He was vain about his appearance in a way that the sources find both human and slightly comic. This man who had crossed the Rubicon and built walls around hilltop fortresses, spending real energy on his hairline. He was also a man with a reputation for romantic relationships that the ancient sources detail with considerable enthusiasm. His affairs were apparently numerous, cross-class, and politically diverse. Servilia, the mother of Brutus, is described as the great love of his life outside of marriage, a relationship that lasted decades and was apparently conducted with the open secret discretion that Roman society applied to such arrangements among the upper classes. His time with Cleopatra produced a son. His soldiers sang ribald marching songs about his romantic history that he apparently accepted with good humour as part of the price of being Julius Caesar. He was also a man who genuinely reformed things. The calendar reform of 46 BC, in which Caesar, working with the Egyptian astronomer Sosigenes, replaced the increasingly chaotic Roman calendar with a solar-based system of 365 days and a leap year every 4 years, was not just administratively necessary. It was an intellectual achievement, acknowledging that accurate reckoning of time required astronomical precision rather than political convenience. The old Roman calendar had drifted so far from astronomical reality that Julius Caesar's reform essentially brought winter back to winter and summer back to summer for the first time in generations. This is a specific, practical, lasting contribution to human life, whose consequences you feel every time you consult a calendar. He was also a man of his time and place, which means he was a man who owned enslaved people, who conquered populations that hadn't asked to be conquered, who played the brutally competitive game of Roman political life with exactly the ruthlessness that game required. Judging him by modern standards is as useful as judging him by Gaulish standards, which is to say, not very useful. Understanding him requires understanding Rome, and understanding Rome requires accepting that a civilization capable of producing the finest legal traditions, philosophical writings, architectural achievements and literary works of the ancient world was also a civilization built on systematic violence, slavery, and imperial extraction. Caesar didn't transcend Rome. He was Rome's perfect expression. All of it, the brilliance and the brutality, the democratic impulse and the authoritarian conclusion, the charm and the ruthlessness wearing the same face, all the way to the last moment. Chapter 15. The Ghost That Wouldn't Leave. One of the extraordinary things about Julius Caesar is that he is more present in the modern world than almost any person from antiquity, not just as historical figure, but as active metaphor, as living reference, as warning, and as inspiration simultaneously. 2,000 years have not dimmed him. If anything, successive centuries have brightened the image, as each age finds new reasons to return to the story of the man from the Subura who wouldn't be stopped. The calendar he reformed is still our calendar. The Julian calendar, adjusted slightly by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582 to become the Gregorian calendar we now use, carries his name in its bones. July carries his name directly. The month of August carries the name of his adopted son Augustus. Every time you write a date, schedule an appointment, check a phone, you are working within a system Julius Caesar commissioned by working with an Egyptian astronomer in 46 BC. The infrastructure of daily time is partly Caesar's legacy. The word Kaiser in German comes from Caesar. Tsar in Russian comes from Caesar. The Arabic Kaisar comes from Caesar. Kaiser Wilhelm, Tsar Nicholas, the long line of German and Russian rulers, whose authority rested on variations of that name, were all, whether they knew it or acknowledged it, borrowing the linguistic prestige of a man from the Subura who crossed a small river in northern Italy in January of 49 BC. The name became the word for supreme power itself, detached from the original person and attached to the concept, which is what happens to people who become large enough to outgrow their own biography. Even the word for a type of surgical birth derives from a legend, almost certainly false, that Caesar was born by this method. but the legend attached to him so completely that the operation bears his name across dozens of languages. He probably was not born by caesarean section. The procedure in antiquity was only performed when the mother had already died, and Caesar's mother Aurelia lived for decades after his birth and was present and active in his adult life. But the story attached itself to him because everything attached itself to him. Legends clustered around Caesar the way iron filings cluster around a magnet. The man was a myth-generating engine even while he was alive, and the engine hasn't stopped since. He was Julius Caesar who made Cicero's career possible, and Cicero who opposed him. The two greatest Latin stylists of the ancient world, on opposite sides of a political and personal conflict, producing work that endures side by side 2 millennia later. Cicero's letters and speeches give us the Republic's last years from the inside, from a man who loved it and watched it die and couldn't stop either outcome. Caesar's commentaries give us the wars that made Caesar powerful enough to end it. Together, they are the most complete picture we have of a civilization in the process of transforming itself, told by its two most articulate witnesses. He was Julius Caesar who made Shakespeare reach for the dramatic potential of political betrayal, of nobility twisted into murder, of the terrible cost of idealism deployed as a weapon. The play Shakespeare wrote in 1599 gets nearly all the historical facts wrong, compresses events, invents scenes, and produces something more true than history, because what Shakespeare understood about Caesar was not the military campaigns or the constitutional crisis. It was the human cost of being surrounded by people who love you and fear what you're becoming, and of being unable to distinguish between the two. Et tu, brute. 3 words Shakespeare gave Caesar that Caesar almost certainly never said, and yet those 3 words carry the whole weight of the story, the shock of recognition, the cost of trust extended too far. He was Julius Caesar who inspired Napoleon, who studied his campaigns obsessively, who regarded him as the standard against which any general or emperor must measure himself. He was Julius Caesar who inspired every subsequent strongman who wanted to wrap authoritarianism in the language of populism and reform. He was also Julius Caesar who inspired every republican who looked at the liberatores and saw men willing to die for civic principle. He is a Rorschach test that has been administered to the Western world for 2 millennia. You see what you need to see in him. The defenders of democracy see in his story a warning. The admirers of strong leadership see in it justification. The historians see in it complexity that resists both readings and rewards anyone willing to sit with a contradiction. What is perhaps most striking, most human about Julius Caesar is the ending he didn't seem to see coming. This man who had crossed the Rubicon, who had calculated every political move with such precision, who had survived wars and pirate captivity and Sullan proscription and the worst conditions Gaul's winter could produce, this man walked into the Senate on the Ides of March without his bodyguard. He had been warned specifically and directly. His wife had begged him to stay home, and still he went. Was it arrogance? Probably some. Was it fatalism, the stoic acceptance that what comes, comes and running only delays it? Perhaps. Was it the accumulated weight of 55 years of being Julius Caesar, of never having been stopped, of the Rubicon and Alesia and Pharsalus and every crossing and every gamble having come through? Almost certainly yes. He had bet everything so many times, and won so many times that perhaps at the end the idea of losing had simply stopped feeling real. The die was cast a long time before the Ides of March. It was cast the day a boy in the Subura looked at his father's body and decided, quietly and permanently, that the world was going to hear his name. He wasn't wrong. Conclusion. We began tonight with a boy in Rome's loudest neighbourhood, born to a family with more prestige than property, more name than wealth, more ambition than any single lifetime could reasonably accommodate. A boy whose father dropped dead one ordinary morning and whose mother responded by doubling down on her son's education, as if that investment was the only one that couldn't be repossessed. We moved through a young man who refused Sulla's order to divorce his wife, fled into the hills with malaria, and came back to Rome with nothing except a name and a plan that no one else could fully see yet. We watched him charm pirates and then crucify them. We watched him borrow impossible amounts of money on the strength of victories that hadn't happened yet, and then go out and make them happen. We watched him spend 9 years converting Gaul from a collection of fierce, independent peoples into Roman provinces, and spend the political capital of that campaign to cross a river in winter and take his own country in a matter of months. We end with a month named after him that you have probably used in casual conversation this week without giving it a second thought. We end with the word Caesar itself, having travelled through Latin into German, Russian, Arabic, and dozens of other languages, attaching itself to the concept of supreme power the way that particular man attached himself to supreme power, irresistibly, inevitably, and with no apparent plan to leave. Julius Caesar lived for 55 or 56 years, depending on the disputed birth date. He spent most of them either broke, in debt, in danger, in exile, or in combat. He spent less than a year as the unchallenged master of Rome before 23 men with daggers made their alternative argument. What he left behind was not the republic he had ostensibly fought to reform. What he left behind was a structure of power, of military loyalty, of administrative organization that his adopted son and heir turned into an empire. What he left behind was the Julian calendar, still running, the month of July, still bearing his name, the word Caesar, still meaning absolute authority in a dozen languages. What he left behind was also a lesson so large it barely fits in a single life. He showed what one person, starting from almost nothing, can accomplish through intelligence, relentlessness, and the refusal to accept that the situation is fixed. He showed that democratic institutions, no matter how old or revered, are not self-maintaining. Someone has to want to preserve them badly enough to do the uncomfortable work of preservation, the tedious, undramatic, unglamorous work of showing up and defending the rules when it would be easier to bend them. He showed that the person most likely to dismantle those institutions will not arrive looking like a tyrant. They will arrive looking like the solution. They will speak the language of reform and the vocabulary of the people. They will be charming and brilliant and genuinely believe, possibly correctly, that they can do what the broken system cannot. And they will be right about the broken system even when they're wrong about themselves. That's what makes him so endlessly fascinating. Not just what he was, what he shows. He shows that one person can change the direction of civilization. He shows that charm and ruthlessness can coexist in the same remarkable package. He shows that democratic institutions, no matter how old or revered, are not self-maintaining. Someone has to want to preserve them badly enough to do the uncomfortable work of preservation. And he shows, perhaps most clearly of all, that the person most likely to destroy those institutions will not announce their intentions. They will arrive speaking the language of reform, carrying the banner of the people, invoking the names of heroes. The die is cast. It's always already cast. The only question is what we do next. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the complete life of Julius Caesar, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Your support is what keeps this channel running and lets us keep diving deep into the stories that shaped our world. Drop a comment telling me which part of Caesar's story struck you most. Whether it's the audacity of the Rubicon, the engineering genius at Alesia, the complicated genius of the man himself, or the tragedy of the Ides of March, I read every comment and I genuinely love hearing what resonates with you. Until next time, sleep well, dream in Latin, and remember that the past is never quite as far away as it looks. Good night.